It's a privilege being here. I personally asked for this music stand because the other one was way too high for me. And so I don't know for you guys, but I've been very, very blessed to be here in these past 2 days, just this morning and yesterday. Love the liberty of the C2C guys to just let us speak on whatever the Spirit is asking us to speak. And so I shared with Jeff Vanderstelt that I was very happy to speak on the second day because then I had all of yesterday to for the Spirit to change everything I had to say. And so I was writing up last night very late, getting up this morning and changing a lot of stuff. But hopefully God will bring a word to you through our time together. I'll just start by praying, then we'll jump into John 6. So Jesus, we're thankful to be here. We're thankful to be your children. We're thankful that our worth is not based on performance. And so I know that you love me. I know that you love all the people in here, whatever their position, whatever their church, their city. They're already fully loved, and so we don't need to feel bad about not being the right type of leader or not being performing as good as some other people we look up to. And thanks for some people that we can look up to and be inspired by. And I pray that we would just rest in the work of Jesus. Amen. Yes, and so John 6, when I was invited to speak to the Multiply conference, the first passage that came to mind was the passage, and you'll have to forgive my English because I don't have to speak English very often. I actually come from a town where it's 97% French speaking, and so I never get to speak in English or preach in English. But I'm sure that we will still have some fun. Okay, is it good? I was a bit coveting Guy Mason's accent there. It was a bit more appealing than the French Quebec accent. And so John 6, the multiplication of the 5 loaves and 2 fish, or the Multiply conference. And so we're talking about multiplication. And so I thought we could learn some interesting things about how Jesus performs multiplication. And so in John 6, verse 5, it says, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? He said this to test him, for he himself knew what he would do. Philip answered him, 200 denarii worth of bread would not be enough for each of them to get a little. One of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there is a boy here who has 5 loaves and 2 fish. But what are they for so many? Jesus said, have the people sit down. Now there was much grass in the place, so the men sat down, about 5,000 in number. Jesus then took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they had eaten their fill, he told his disciples, gather up the leftover fragments, that nothing may be lost. So they gathered them up and filled 12 baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten. So what lessons can we learn about multiplication in this story of the 5 loaves and 2 fish? The first thing that came up to me as I was reading the passage was Jesus' compassion. There's this in another gospel where it says that Jesus, when he saw the multitude, had compassion for them. And here it says he saw the crowd coming and says, well, how are we going to feed them? Where are we going to get bread for all these people? And so the first word I think God wants us to hear is that God has compassion for Canada. God sees Canada, Jesus sees Canada, he sees the multitudes that are unfed, and he has compassion for them. The second thing is that we see that Jesus wants to feed the crowds. We know that Jesus wants to feed Canada. We know that he has compassion for them and he wants to feed them. And so then Jesus tests his disciples to find out what solutions they would turn to. And it's pretty interesting because sometimes I feel that Jesus in these conferences is actually testing us and saying, what solutions are you going to turn to once you get out of here? And so the first reaction is pretty much our natural reaction. Philip starts calculating if this is possible human-wise. And I think this is actually where we most often feel the most comfortable. If we see, okay, we have this mission to accomplish, and okay, we have the right resources, we have the right guy, we have everything in place, we have the right strategy, we have the right curriculum for discipleship, everything is set, the guy's got the good seminary degree and all that, then, yeah, I think it's possible. We can feed that crowd, we can feed the multitudes. But the interesting thing here is that Jesus is testing his disciples to see where they will turn. And as Philip is calculating all this, he realizes that it's going to be impossible humanly. And so then a second disciple comes up, and it's Andrew. And he brings this ridiculous idea to Jesus. And we actually see in the text that he feels kind of dumb as he's bringing this idea. Because he says, but what are they for so many? Like, yeah, well, Jesus, there's 5,000 people here, or even more with the women and children. And, well, we have 5 loaves and 2 fish. And you can just imagine, like, him almost being embarrassed of saying that and hoping the other disciples don't hear. And I feel that sometimes that's how we feel when God puts a word or the Spirit brings us a ridiculous idea and we have to share it. But Andrew decides to obey the Spirit and say, well, this is what we've got. I'll bring it to Jesus and see what he does. And so the next thing we see is that the little boy brings the 5 loaves and 2 fish to Jesus. So he brings something to Jesus. And then what is interesting is that Jesus gives a command. He doesn't tell the disciples yet what he's going to do, but he gives them a command. He tells them to get the people seated down in groups. And so we see that the disciples bring obedience to now Jesus' ridiculous idea. Because Jesus is bringing them this ridiculous idea. Okay, we have 5 breads and 2 loaves. Okay, get the people to get seated. Like, yeah, okay, this is embarrassing. We have to get them seated, and we'll pretend that we think that, like, the people think they're going to be fed, and we know we only have 5 loaves and 2 fish. But out of faith, they decide to obey Jesus. And so what we see is that Jesus uses all of that. He uses when Philip realizes that it's impossible, so I'll have to turn to another solution. He uses Andrew's stupid idea. He uses the boy's insufficient lunch, and he uses the obedience by faith to God's crazy solution for this. But what happens is that he multiplies all that to feed the multitudes. And so I hope, church, that as we're gathering here, we realize that, as Sean was sharing about all these speakers, and sometimes we hear them, and sometimes we envy them, sometimes we say, oh, if only I would have that success, or if only Francis Chan would be pastoring my church, then things would be good. I hope you realize that Francis Chan's best efforts, and Jeff Vanderstelt's best efforts, and Marc Clark's best efforts, and Guy Mason's best efforts are no more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. I hope you realize that even our mega churches, even in our multiple campus churches, are close to nothing when we look at the needs of the multitudes. Marc Clark mentioned that yesterday about walking out the office and seeing all these people that are not in his church and being broken about that. Even our biggest churches, even Village Church and Westside Church combined, are nothing more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. Maybe 7 loaves. So do you actually think that Jesus sees your church or my church of smaller numbers and seeing like, they have 5 loaves or 3 loaves, and then Village Church has 7 loaves. Okay, I can really do more with 7 loaves to feed the thousands. No, he's not impressed with that. Church, we are not impressive. The celebrity culture in our church is not impressive. But we do worship an impressive God. And if only we would bring what we have to Jesus. If we would hand to Jesus what we have a church of 5, bring your church of 5 and give it to Jesus. You have a church of 5,000, bring it to Jesus. Because Jesus has all the necessary power to take what you hand him and to multiply it to feed the nations, not only Canada. So he has the power to feed all of Canada, but he even has greater power that he could take the little that you give him and he could multiply it to feed not only Canada, but all the nations. And that's the power of the God we serve. And so as I'm entering this talk, I pray that we understand that it's not about our great strategies or ways of doing things. And I'll be sharing some of the ways we've done ministry in Quebec and how we're seeing people being reached with the gospel. But it's not about our strategies. It's not about what the ways we do things. It's about who do we bring them to. Who do we bring our strategies to? He's the one who can multiply. We cannot multiply. Only Jesus can multiply. And so I hope also that we understand that the heart of the gospel should not lead us to be cheap in the way we lead our churches. What I mean is that we try to save or preserve what God has given us. If that little boy would have said, no, those 5 loaves and 2 fish are very, very important to me, he would not have had been blessed to take part in Jesus' miracle, because he would have kept it to himself. So the gospel should lead us to want to lose our lives and even lose our churches. Are we willing to sacrifice our churches for the sake of the gospel? Because that's what the Bible teaches. In Mark 8, it says, Mark 8:35 says, "For whoever would save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it." So if you're leading your church in a way where you're in survival mode and seeing how are we going to protect this church and preserve this church and save this church, Jesus says you will lose it. But he says, if you use the resources that I give you, your church, and you sacrifice it for the kingdom, and you lose your church along the way, you'll gain it. It will be saved. Jesus will use it and apply it for his glory. So we should be willing to sacrifice even our churches for the sake of the gospel. because we worship the one who sacrificed himself. He lost everything for our sake. I need to use a tissue. I always do, but so just one sec, okay? Oh, the mic went off, that's good. I hope you don't feel embarrassed about this little moment, because I don't. So we worship the one who sacrificed everything for us. And that's the only motivation that can be real in the life of any Christian. Why do we sacrifice our lives? Why do we go in the trenches? Why do we plant churches? Why do established churches plant churches? Why do even established churches who are not doing well sending out people? That makes no sense apart from the gospel, apart from the fact that we understand that you are loved by Jesus, that he sacrificed everything, and so you don't have anything to lose because you have everything in Jesus. So church, I want you to understand that we don't have much to offer. It's an illusion that we have something to offer Canada, if we're looking at what we can do. But we have everything to offer if we offer Jesus. And so we don't have much to offer, but Jesus is asking you to bring what you do have to him. And all that we have, we've received. So let's not be cheap by trying to preserve everything that we've got, keeping it to ourselves for our own sake, for our own survival, and let's start being generous. Let's start being generous with our people. Let's start being generous with our resources, bringing them to Jesus, giving them to Jesus, saying to Jesus, those were never mine. Please take them, please multiply them for your glory. Because Christianity has never been about playing it safe. We have a heritage that is not about playing safe. Jesus did not play it safe. The apostles did not play it safe. It's not about getting your talent from the master and hiding it. It's about risking what he's given you and making sure that it will multiply before he comes back. And so today I want to share a bit of my story, about a bit of my testimony of what I have seen Jesus multiply with the little that we brought to him in Quebec. And I'm really happy because the story doesn't start with me. It starts with Jesus. Everything starts with Jesus. It always starts with Jesus. And it starts with people who are moved by the love of Jesus. And so Jesus giving his life for us, being sacrificial in loving us. And because he loved us so much, in the 1950s, a group of English-speaking men and women in Ontario were grasped by the sacrificial love of Jesus Christ. And they decided to leave the comfort of their language, the comfort of their culture, and come share the gospel of Jesus Christ, the French-speaking people of Quebec. And one of those missionaries gave a New Testament to my grandmother. And she gave it to my grandfather. And he read it, and he gave his life to Christ. And he became the first convert of that missionary team in Quebec in the 50s. But at that time, the Roman Catholic church was very controlling of the people in Quebec, very oppressive, abusive of their power. They didn't want the people of Quebec to read the Bible. They said it was only for the clergy, and that it would drive you crazy to try to understand the book. And so, though that missionary team was actually persecuted, put in prison for preaching the gospel on the street corners of Quebec in the 50s. And so that missionary team spent a total of 3 years in prison for preaching the gospel. And like it was mentioned earlier, Quebec is still today considered French-speaking Quebec is still considered the largest unreached people group in all of the Americas, North, Central, South America combined. Largest unreached people group, Quebec. But one thing I know, that if I'm standing here today, if I have a story to tell about Jesus, it's because some men and women knew Jesus deeply. They knew his love, and they were seized by his love, and they chose not to play it safe. They chose to sacrifice. They chose to risk. They chose to embrace suffering, as we heard yesterday. Embrace obedience and to proclaim the living God to this dead nation. And so some in Quebec were brought back to life, especially from the 50s to the mid-80s. But then after that, something happened that often happens with churches. The church was small in Quebec and was struggling, and now it had something. Now it had some congregations, it was starting to have some buildings, and so now they had something to lose. And they started thinking that it was more than 5 loaves and 2 fish. And so they started trying to preserve it and thinking that that is preserving our heritage. But that's the opposite of preserving your heritage, because your heritage is about sacrificial love. And so the church in Quebec started living for survival rather than for sacrificing for the gospel. And from the mid-80s to about 2010, the number of Christians in Quebec remained pretty much the same. Very, very few conversions in 25 to 30 years. To a point that from the time I was born to when I was about 30 years old, I could count on one hand the number of unchurched people that came to faith in the churches I was part of. But even in the midst of that unhealthy season, I was privileged to be part of a church which, although they weren't seeing much movement, they were moved by the love of Jesus also. And they decided to not look at their own comfort and survival, but they decided to send us out with 100 people to plant a new church. That was a quarter of their congregation. So they stepped out in faith and said, we'll send you out in the same town where we are, in the downtown area, and we're going to plant a new church in that city. And the senior pastor of that church actually mentioned to me that he would rather die giving birth than to not give birth. He said, if our congregation needs to die while giving birth to this new congregation, it will be worth it. Because that's the gospel, and that doesn't make sense outside of understanding Jesus and knowing Jesus. So we went off with 100 people, spent the first 4 months of our time together. We called it deprogramming the Christians and reprogramming them. Reprogramming them as missionaries. So we started asking the same questions that overseas missionaries would ask about reaching a people group. Saying like, okay, so where should we live to be effective in reaching that people group? Where do these people do life together? How are they structured as a society? What music do they listen to? How do they walk? What do they eat? And all that. And sometimes so it was a bit strange because I was born and raised in Quebec, and all of our congregation was born and raised in Quebec, so we're like, we know our culture, we are our culture. But what I realize is that sometimes we think we know our culture, but actually we know our evangelical culture. And so I was so used to being around evangelical people and a lot of my friends being in the church that it was not true that I understood the people in Quebec. And so we studied our culture, and we realized that one of the things we realized was that in Quebec, Sunday morning would be crucial, would be a key to reaching our culture. What happens is that in Quebec, Quebec is scared of cults. And anything that has to do with spirituality better happen on a Sunday morning in a real official gathering, or else it's probably a cult. So for them, it's intimidating to say, oh, well, go sit in the living room and talk about Jesus. That's scary. And so we had to decide to sacrifice our Sunday gathering. Not that we would get rid of it, but that we would redeem it and make sure that because we knew our people, that we would use it strategically. The church can meet, the Christians, we can meet anywhere, anytime. So, but we have to be ready to sacrifice our preferences to see how do we reach the people God has sent us to. And then we realize that where we meet matters to those people. Sometimes churches, like established churches, people will say, yeah, well, we're the church, we're like the worship style doesn't matter, where we meet doesn't matter, like we're all about Jesus, so only Jesus is needed. And that's absolutely true, especially for Christians. So let's sacrifice all that and see what can we do that will matter to non-Christians and help them meet Jesus. And so we decided to just meet in this theater that was a well-known theater in the city, just so that there would be no obstacles for them to come in. Then we realized that the way we greet people mattered. We realized that for Quebecers, it would take them a lot of courage to just step inside a church service. And so we decided that when they would come in, we would greet them, be nice to them, but we would not overwhelm them. And we weren't going to be there saying, are you new here? Are you and asking all these questions. And so we would let them come in, grab a coffee, sit down. The light is dim like this, and they just sit there. And up to that point, everything in their experience is something they experience in everyday life. And so there's no obstacles up to that point. And then we realized that the order in which we do the service, the gathering, mattered. I have no clue how much time I have left. I think I don't have any time left already. It's the first time I look at the clock, and I'm seeing 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then minus 4. Well. And so we needed to sacrifice a lot of our personal preferences. And there were people that decided to change churches, leave. We had to sacrifice our reputation. Other churches were judging us that because we're changing the methods, that it was actually, we were diluting the gospel. And we're saying, no, it's the opposite. We're trying to take away all the obstacles so that people, their only obstacle will be the cross. If people reject the cross, that's their problem. But if they reject anything other than the cross, that's our problem. We were using language that we're saying we're actually sinning against Jesus. We're sinning against the gospel. We're sinning against the people of Quebec if we put unnecessary obstacles before the cross. Because we don't want people to think they rejected the cross when they rejected this model or whatever else we're doing. And so we've seen people then gain confidence that they could bring people there, and their personal evangelism became evangelism as community. And then people were invited into community because that's how you train disciples in everyday life. And so we saw that for us, it was starting from the Sunday gathering and then bringing them to understand the gospel in everyday life. But that's different in every context. But all of this, so then we got involved in church planting, started saying we need to get the message out. People are responding with faith in Quebec because we're seeing, at first we see our first baptism, 7 people get baptized, and 3 of them are from unchurched background. And I'm the church planter, and I'm like, what? Like, this never happened. like in my lifetime. And then the next baptism comes, we're praying, we're fasting, and then 31 people get baptized. And then after that, another 25, and then after that. And so the Christians get excited. Now they're expecting God to do multiplication. And so they're praying more, they're sharing the gospel more, they're living with gospel intentionality just because now they're seeing that Jesus transforms lives. So all of this, because I have to wrap up, all of this because Jesus did not preserve his own life. He didn't look to save his own life, but he gave it away. All this because men and women were willing to give out New Testaments and preach the gospel despite losing everything and being imprisoned for the gospel. They brought it to Jesus so that he would multiply it. And it's exciting to see what God is doing in Quebec right now. He's not only doing it in our church, but in all other churches throughout Quebec. And it's very exciting to see what God is doing. But still, God reminded me afresh this summer that all we still have are still only 5 loaves and 2 fish. The day we will start thinking that we have more than that and that we need to preserve it, we will lose it. But as long as we keep bringing it to Jesus, he will multiply it to his glory. Amen.